So Laura, I know we probably want to wait a bit for more folks to sign in. However, I do have a little intro that won't be the end of the world if folks miss. So wondering if you want to just go ahead and get to respect those who are here right on time. If we could just go ahead and start with intros.
Sure, that would be great. And I also want to say thank you to everyone for coming. You will be muted, and please feel free to be muted until we break out into small breakout groups, and then we welcome conversation and participation at that point. I also want to thank the IDNR Urban and Community Forestry Program for the grant that made this possible. And we are really grateful for all the work that they do with Tree City USA and look forward to bringing you more information about that in the future. With that, I'm going to turn it over to August Ball.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, friends. So again, my name is August Ball. I'm the founder and CEO of Cream City Conservation. I come to you from the ancestral lands of the Menominee and Potawatomi people here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. While we are based in the Wisconsin area, we do work globally, but all of the proceeds from our work return right back here to Milwaukee County. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I've recently had the honor of serving on Governor Evers' Climate Action Task Force, as well as our local county and city climate and economic equity task force as an appointee. And I've served on the U.S. Water Alliance's water equity team representing Milwaukee as a delegate. And I'm also a board member of the Green Leadership Trust, which is a national organization that supports environmentalists of color in their service to environmental boards. These are just some examples of organizations that we work with and have supported, but not at all an exhaustive list. We've worked with over 100 companies so far, organizations all around the nation and internationally, including Toronto and South Africa. For those of you who might not be familiar with social enterprises, we essentially take what we consider to be the best parts of business and the best parts of non-for-profit work and combine that together. So that means that we are independent of grants directly. And we take the profits from our work, doing consulting work, workshops like this, and we use that to provide paid training and employment opportunities for young adults, specifically of color, right here in the Milwaukee area, helping to offset a lot of the land management needs that are not currently covered through our tax levy. So some of the examples of the social impact work that we do as a result of the consulting work that we'll be doing today go to support programs such as our annual Green Job Summit, as well as our conservation crew, which builds trail and removes invasive species all along Milwaukee County parkland, and also prepares young adults for careers in forestry. We also work in the space of green infrastructure alongside our local workforce agency and our Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. This program introduces water careers to youth and young adults in the Milwaukee area, helping to mitigate the climate impacts and address the aging gray infrastructure of our community. These young adults do this not only through downspout disconnects and installing green infrastructure, but also educating community members on the value of rain gardens and bioswales and rain barrels to reduce flooding on their homes. We also work in the space of urban agriculture, and we do this in partnership with the local Boys and Girls Clubs, as well as our local public school system. These teenagers get to grow food from seed. They learn about soil science, and they, before the pandemic, would sell their produce to local restaurants, and the money would go back into the program. They would also create salads alongside some of the chefs at these local restaurants and sell them at Brewer games on Sundays. But this year and last year, since the pandemic, it's all kind of a blur when this actually started. But since the pandemic, we've shifted over to donating the produce grown by the youth instead. So we look forward to returning to the Brewer Stadium, but probably won't happen for another year or so. We also support the work of an organization that was once known as Alliance for Climate Education, currently known as Action for the Climate Emergency, in establishing their Milwaukee and Madison Climate Action Fellowship programs. These young adults helped to register over 20,000 people to vote in the state of Wisconsin alone in the last election. They also work alongside local officials. As you can see here, our Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes is a huge supporter of the program. And these young adults learn how to lobby, how to hold our elected officials accountable for protecting their future and the environment for generations to come. And lastly, this year, we started a reentry program connecting returning citizens to careers in green infrastructure and waterways as well. I'm proud to announce that all of our graduates come the end of this month will secure full-time unsubsidized employment with private industry and government industry. So they've been trained up since April. They've all received their green infrastructure or completed their green infrastructure national license and received their OSHA 30, amongst many other certifications that are industry recognized. So really proud of this program, especially because of the end result of employment at the end, which is oftentimes the missing piece to these training programs. So we do all this to showcase that this work is possible, that we can create our own funnel of talent. Not that it's our personal goal to do this forever, but rather to change the face of conservation and environmentalism through education, through opportunities, while also changing the culture within our industry that has kept us so racially homogenous over all these years. And I always like to ground myself in images of cute kids to remind me why I do this work that is nonlinear and doesn't always feel the best. I often say that this work is the key difference between a massage and physical therapy. While the intent is not to be harmful or painful, that discomfort is catalytic to the work. It is unfortunately simply part of the process. And staying in our comfort zone doesn't allow us to move forward and to actually face the things that need to be faced. So our learning framework, friends, is to build awareness, inspire inquiry, and produce change behavior. So the purpose of this workshop is not to tell any of you what to think, what to believe, or how to feel, but rather the intention is to challenge the existing attitudes, beliefs, perspectives, and experiences you may have had in light of some new information. The methodology that I lean on is to explain the historical construction of race and to show how the system of racism drives the inequitable outcomes that we see across all social systems. It's also my intention to help individuals and organizations assess the impacts that race has on our very own socialization and examine our role and agency within that framework. Our methodology is also to help organizations and individuals assess the ways that we might be unintentionally upholding some very problematic dynamics in our policies, our practices, our organizational culture, and our decision-making, especially when it is related to partnerships and funding. Lastly, but most importantly, my intention is to help co-create a learning community with all of you today. A learning community that is grounded in vulnerability and trust, and that allows us to collectively reflect and to strategize and to produce the changes necessary to foster an environment where everyone can thrive despite their identity. So in order to co-create this environment, I am going to ask that we abide by some group agreements. And these group agreements are as follows. The first is that I request that you stay in relationship. And what I mean by this is pay attention to when you might be shutting down, experience discomfort. As I mentioned, discomfort is catalytic to growth. And if our priority is staying comfortable, then we have to admit that we're not ready to engage in this work yet. Being uncomfortable is the lowest bar of ask for this work. Expect and accept non-closure. This work is not going to fit neatly into a bento box. It is ever ongoing. And while we call it a journey, it doesn't exactly have a final destination. I liken it to getting healthy, right? We can do all the steps. We can drink all the water. We can eat all our vegetables. We can meditate. We can go for walks. But if we stop doing those things, our health is also going to decline. The same is so for anti-racism, anti-bias work. This means that we have to be patient with ourselves while simultaneously holding ourselves accountable for continuous progress. I invite you to listen to understand. At this point, we already know everything we are going to know. And so I hope that your intention for being here today is to gain new knowledge. We want to be careful not to compare our individual experiences with others, especially when our identity might be different than the person sharing their story. And to take note when we feel called to debate over listening. I invite you to speak your truth and to be open to the truths of others. We are all going to be at different places in this work, and we are all responsible for our own growth. I cannot transform your organizations. I cannot transform you for you. All I can do is offer you information. What you do with that information is totally up to you. This also means that this is our opportunity to change how this work is often approached, to shift our thinking around what qualifies us as good people. Too often, I see individuals and groups of people embark on this work with a sense of self-righteousness around where they are in their journey and almost annoyance with where others are. And we perceive where an individual is along their journey as indicative of their character and their intelligence, which produces a very unhelpful environment because it makes us aversive to correction. It makes us aversive to feedback because we are presented with these two binary options of either we are a racist person or we are a non-racist. And the reality is this existence is a spectrum, and none of us are absolved from the impacts of racism. We all experience it differently based on our identities, but it impacts us nonetheless. So if you take nothing else away from what I say today, it is that where we are in this journey has nothing to do with our intelligence or our character. It is simply a manifestation of what we have had the opportunity to be exposed to. That being said, once we have been given the gift of information, should we choose to ignore it, well, then that's a different story. And that then is our responsibility to navigate that cognitive dissonance that comes along with that choice. So here are our objectives, friends. Albert Einstein once said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes studying that problem and 5 minutes solving it. Now, I am going to go on a limb and make an assumption that all of you are doers. You are drawn to the work that you do because you want to create change. You want to either protect something or make something better. And so sitting around studying things may or may not be, your idea of change creation. And that's a beautiful thing. That being said, fools rush in. And sometimes when we don't have all the information and we rush in to solve a problem, we actually do more harm than good. So despite all of our other sessions being very interactive and going into breakout rooms, that will not be the case for this first session. This first session is about setting the foundation for understanding. And this is because we are a mixed group of folks of varying identities, and I want to protect those of us on this call who might be severely impacted by the innocence of others. And so I ask that you all join me and offer me your grace and patience as I set the table for this work so that we are better informed to have more helpful and productive conversations in our continuing sessions. So our objectives for today are defining race. We use a lot of terms around society that we never actually check in with one another to make sure we have a shared definition and a shared understanding of these words. So we're going to do that today. We're also going to interrogate the historical construction of race. We're going to begin developing shared language and a shared historical and structural and cultural analysis of the system of racism to create a foundation for meaningful dialogue and change behavior. We're also going to examine the role that conservation and public policy has played in maintaining and establishing racial oppression. We're also going to define racial equity and identify behaviors, mindsets that advance or hinder racial equity. And lastly, we're going to conclude with introducing the concept of moving from allyship to co-conspiratorship. Are there any questions about these objectives? Okay. I want to return back actually to our group agreements and ask that if you can all agree to these group agreements, please do type into the chat, I agree. If you are not able to agree to these group agreements, please raise your hand so that we can dialogue on where I may have lost you, because this is a prerequisite to us being able to move forward. And I want to make sure we're all on the same page as to these agreements. This does not mean that we expect perfection, but it does, however, mean that we are agreeing to be held accountable and to be called in when we might be falling short of these group agreements. Thank you. All right. To start us off, could I have one volunteer read this definition of race by Dr. Malana Karinga?
Do that. What is race? A specious classification of human beings created by Europeans during a period of worldwide colonial expansion, using themselves as the model for humanity, for the purposes of assigning and maintaining white skin access to power and privilege, and to legitimize the dominance of white people over non-white people.
Thank you, Elsa. Okay. So right out the gate, we are presented with a very bold claim. Friends, what does the word specious mean to you? You can put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Specious, what does that mean? Without Googling it, like I did. Any chat? Unfound. Oh yeah, thank you. Separated, unfounded, basis, arbitrary. You all are much more smarter than me. Intentionally arbitrary. Thank you. Yeah. So when I first read this, I thought Dr. Karinga and I were going to have beef, because I was like, really? But yes, thank you. Specious essentially means superficially plausible, but actually wrong. So I was like, okay, so race is a superficially plausible, but actually wrong process of classifying human beings. Okay, noted. I'm still with Dr. Karinga. When was this superficially plausible, but actually wrong process of classifying human beings created? During a period of worldwide colonial expansion. Okay, so we're talking the beginnings of the 1400s till today. Okay, so then who created this superficially plausible, but actually wrong process of classifying human beings during a period of worldwide colonial expansion, roughly beginning in the 1400s to the 1700s, well into today? Europeans. Okay, but why? Well, for the purpose of assigning and maintaining white skin access to power and privilege, and to legitimize the dominance of white people over non-white people. All right. Well, let's dive a bit further. So if we know that race isn't a real thing, it was made up to justify, quite frankly, injustifiable acts, what about then the system of racism? Well, the system of racism is simply a system of advantage and disadvantage based on the idea of race. And a system is nothing more than an established way of getting things done, a perceived to be normal way of doing things. So when we combine these two understandings of functionality, we can note that racism involves the systemic disadvantage of people of color. It has been built into our US systems and our institutions. It's deeply woven into our economic fabric. I'm sorry, Laura, could you mute everyone? There's a bit of background noise. Thank you. And the system of racism continues to function because both members of the oppressed and the privileged groups are socialized to play their roles as so racism, therefore, involves the combination of racial prejudice coupled with social and institutional power. So this means that racial prejudice that is in favor of white people and against people of color is deeply embedded into our existing policies, norms, and practices amongst society. And when we say social and institutional power, we are referring to access to resources, the ability to influence others, access to decision makers to get what we want done, and the ability to define reality for oneself and for others. What is also interesting about this is that I oftentimes hear individuals use the term racism and racial prejudice interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. So why then, friends, is it so hard to talk about race and racism? Why does this make us so itchy? Any thoughts on that? Let's see. Reluctance to give up power because we know it's inherently wrong. It's uncomfortable. Yeah, we all come from different perspectives. Guilt and ignorance, guilt, uncomfortable. We don't want to admit our own privilege. Nobody wants to admit wrongness. We don't want to offend. Yeah, feels like a zero-sum game. It's painful, uncomfortable, makes us feel like a bad person. Listeners are hard to find. Large topics to tackle. Yes, fear of saying the wrong thing, not knowing what to say. Yes, all of that. Please keep those coming in the chat. Yeah. So there are levels to this work, and we're going to start by demystifying some of those levels of racism and exploring them more deeply. Let's start off first with internalized racism. So internalized racism is a component that is actually probably the least discussed, but it is also the component that we have the most power over. So internalized racism is the personal, conscious or unconscious acceptance of the dominant society's views, stereotypes, and biases. Essentially internalizing that whiteness is right and everything else is otherized or on the peripheral or marginal, perhaps less valuable. Interpersonal racism is probably the level of racism, the component of racism that we're most familiar with because it's oftentimes very visible, but not always. And this is the harassment, exclusion, marginalization, the discrimination, violence, and even hatred against others. Institutional racism is racism that is built into our policies, our procedures, our everyday practices, and it determines our culture. It determines whose comfort level is prioritized. It determines who has the ability to succeed, who receives support, who's believed. Systemic racism is racism that overlaps and intersects between different institutions. This essentially amplifies the different treatment that people of color receive in comparison to that which white people receive, ensuring different outcomes. I have a question for you all, friends. How do you get ahead in America? Based on the messaging you've received growing up, currently, how do you get ahead in America? Cheat. Good work, okay. Cheat and lie, familial wealth, worker connections, social capital, be white and male, education, financial success, connections, look out for yourself, luck, compete. Okay. Yeah. I see a lot of money, and we're going to delve into how does one acquire money? We're going to delve into that today. Have rich parents. Yeah, but where do your rich parents get their money from? Where do they get their riches from? How did that come to be? Subscribing to capitalism. Yeah. I will offer that we're all participating in capitalism under duress. Okay, thank you. Having land and yes, so again, we're gonna go a little bit further into how does one acquire these things, right? Because it's not as simple as saying, oh yeah, if you want to get ahead, buy some land. Well, where do you buy the land? How do you buy it? Where do you get the money to buy the land? Is everyone able to access the same type of land, equal quality land? Where did this land come from? So we're going to delve a bit further into this. For the most part, if you're like me, the messaging that you received growing up, that was that in order to get ahead, it was connected somehow to increased effort, right? If you were a woman, you had to work twice as hard as a man. If you were a person of color, you worked twice as hard as a white person. All in all, the goal was just to increase effort, right? Work harder, just outwork everyone. That will get you ahead. And we're going to interrogate that today. Oops, sorry, I'm going to remute some folks. So let's start off with a brief history lesson. How many of you are familiar with, well, actually, before I even go, well, yeah, how many of you are familiar with the name John Punch? Anyone heard of John Punch before? Okay, so no worries. So how about Turtle Island? Does anyone know what Turtle Island is or where it is? Oh, I see some, sorry, I'm trying to keep up with the chat. Okay, I hear some people say yes. Okay, it's the Earth. Yeah, so Turtle Island, friends, is actually this plot of land that if you're in North America right now, that we are all on. And Turtle Island is what the indigenous people of this land that we are occupying referred to their homeland as. And so prior to the practice of slavery, colonizers from Europe had a practice known as the headright system. And the headright system was a practice of indentured servitude. Someone would either be traded into indentured servitude, or they would trade themselves into indentured servitude for a period of time, oftentimes 4 to 7 years, and to get money or access to getting somewhere. So when colonizers from Europe came to Turtle Island, they brought with them the system of the practice of the headright system. And so many of them brought with them individuals from Europe to help work the land and to spread the colony, so to speak. And so the practice was, if you were a European man, you could buy a ticket to come on a boat and come to this new land, and you would receive, 50 acres of land alongside that boat ticket that you bought. If you were wealthy, you probably didn't want to work that land yourself. And so you would reserve the services of an indentured servant. Let's say you reserve the services of 2 indentured servants. So now, because you bought their boat tickets, you would have 150 acres of land and 2 people to work that land for you for the next 4 to 7 years, without any additional cost other than food and housing. The conditions of an indentured servant, though, were oftentimes not much better than enslavement. And so there were various indentured servants from all around the globe who came over to Turtle Island. There were also individuals who did not have a lot of money, who bought their own ticket and worked their own land that was confiscated from the indigenous inhabitants and given or sold off to the colonizers. But we'll get into that in a moment. So I just want to share this as foundation for where we are today. So because the conditions were often so harsh, many of these indentured servants would attempt to run away, and they would end up in different areas. Because many of them were white, they were able to blend in with the other colonizers in different areas and start a new life. But keeping in mind that oftentimes indentured servants were not always white. Again, we didn't have the terms of white, Black, Asian, back in the day. Everyone was referred to as their ethnicity. And there's one indentured servant in particular that we should know, whose name is John Punch. John Punch was an indentured servant in Virginia, and he worked alongside 2 other indentured servants, a Scotsman and an Irishman, I believe. And the 3 of them decided that, their working conditions were so harsh that they didn't think they were going to survive through their indentured servitude. And so they made a plan to run away. So they ran away and unfortunately were captured and were sent to trial. The Scotsman and the Irishman were sentenced to additional time in servitude. John Punch, being a Black indentured servant of African descent, was sentenced to life enslavement, thus becoming the first documented Black man to not only be transferred into slavery, but also receiving a different sentence for the exact same crime as white individuals. Now, as I mentioned, because it was a bit easier for white-skinned indentured servants to run away, this created some tension between the bourgeoisie and the impoverished whites. And so we have many rebellions where poor white farmers who were frustrated with the feeling as though they had been lied to, that the crops that they were growing they were not able to sell them for a fair price. They were promised this land of milk and honey, but the most fertile lands were reserved for the bourgeoisie, who were simply sitting on these plots of land, waiting for more, cheap labor or free labor to help till that land. And so the House of Burgesses decided that this violence that was occurring with these uprisings between poor whites against wealthy whites, because many folks were losing their lives during this period of time, they decided that in order to quell these uprisings, they needed to create a system that made these poor white individuals feel important and feel that they too could have access to wealth one day if they simply continued to support the bourgeoisie. And so the House of Burgesses created the concept known today as the white man. And they assigned various privileges to that. So the House of Burgesses decided that masters who had white indentured servants were required upon completion of their indentured servitude to provide their indentured servants with 50 acres of land, 30 shillings, a musket, and 10 bushels of corn. This created an inspiration or a carrot, if you will, for the white indentured servants to continue out their service. I should also note that the House of Burgess still exists today. It's known as the Virginia Assembly. So you can imagine that this creation of the concept of whiteness also laid the foundation for white supremacy culture. Because now we had this notion that, well, look at how hardworking these white servants are in comparison to the non-white servants. This is also where I remind you that not everyone who is considered white today was considered white during the 17th century. So if you were Polish, Irish, Italian, definitely not white. But if you were Danish, Swedish, German, English, white, and you had various privileges connected to that. So throughout the late 1600s, race as a social construct became foundational for the expansion of colonization across the US. And as I mentioned, this fostered the white supremacy ideology that continues to grow today. In addition to the benefits that were received by those who were classified at the time as white, whites were also given additional privileges, such as the Land Ordinance Act, that allowed for white people only to purchase acres of land for $1 each. This also meant that the naturalization law meant that only white immigrants were eligible for naturalized citizenship, and all other immigrants were denied the rights to vote, own property, own land, and have civil rights even. So as an example, if you were not classified as white and there was a judgment brought against you, you could not testify. If you were harmed by a white person and you yourself were not white, you could not hold that person accountable in a court of law. You couldn't testify against them. And what's often not discussed is the growing abolitionist movement during this time. Due to the growing abolitionist movement against the system of slavery, the bourgeoisie decided that they needed to concoct a scientific justification for the racial hierarchy that it was instituting. And thus, we engaged in the services of a particular Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. So Johann Friedrich Blumenbach is not the individual who classified people into the various quote unquote races, like the Caucasoid race, the Negroid race, the Mongoloid race. That was this guy, Carolus Linnaeus, who was a Swedish naturalist. But Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was charged with studying the skulls of the various quote unquote races. And after all of his research, he found that there was no biological difference in any of the races. But he noted in his report that still it be found serviceable to the memory to have constituted certain classes into which the men of our planet may be divided. As I mentioned, Carolus Linnaeus devised a system that showed how living things are related to one another. He's also often credited with the tree of life. So again, as Americans were debating the future of slavery and the role that African Americans in the nation at the time were going to play, scientists were trying to understand the world by naming, sorting, and categorizing every part of it. So you can also imagine, friends, that with all of these new requirements that wealthy white colonizers were now required to provide for their white indentured servants, their appetite for free labor grew, and thus they turned their ships to places like Africa. What's also interesting that we continue to see today is that whiteness is seeped into our culture by means of holding the perspective that something doesn't exist until a white man discovers it and names it, despite the fact that these components already had names and had been identified by others prior. So I mentioned that this land that was colonized, that we are all occupying today, already had inhabitants upon it, right? So it's very difficult to discover something that's already inhabited, but that's going down a whole nother conversation that I think you all get the point. And so because this land was already inhabited by groups of people, the colonizers noted that this was a problem. They needed to remove these individuals, and thus introduced the Indian Removal Act, which you may know as the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act produced the death of over 4,000 Cherokee Nation members alone, who were violently forced off of their land and demised from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. When criticized by about this policy, President Andrew Jackson's response was, it was not the greed of white settlers that drove policy, but the inevitable fate of an inferior people established in the midst of a superior race. The Mexican-American War, very short war, that ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, produced the experience that over 55% of Mexican land was transferred to US control virtually overnight. What I find quite interesting is that if we were to superimpose a map of the pre-Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo border and compare that to where people of Mexican descent and identity are residing today, it actually shows a very different story than one that's often presented to us in our media with regards to, Mexicans crossing the border illegally, supposedly. To me, this shows that the border actually crossed over Mexico. So I just think that's an interesting thing to note. In addition, the Homestead Act, which is often marketed, sorry, I have like a little gnat here. The Homestead Act that was marketed as a great piece of legislation that made way for our agricultural system, in my education at least, was failed to mention that this was an act that exclusively benefited whites only. 85 million acres of Native American land were stolen and sold off exclusively to whites for $1.25 per acre. I also invite you to Google $5 Indians, because over time, as various tribes and bands are able to hold our nation somewhat accountable for their atrocities, various actions and pieces of legislation that were initially intended to rectify these injustices essentially only serve to support non-Native individuals anyway. So I invite you to Google $5 Indians at your availability. I'm going to turn off my camera to show a short video.
All right, let's set context first. By 1830, most of the Native American tribes, especially in the Northeast, have been annexed, sent away, have been destroyed, have been broken up. But there are hundreds of thousands of Native Americans that are living on Indian territories within state borders down south. We're talking about Florida, we're talking about Alabama, we're talking about Georgia, we're talking about Mississippi. There's a humongous pressure that's building on the federal government by poor whites down south. They want to get their hands on this land. So they elect their leader in 1828, and that's the Democrat Andrew Jackson, who makes it his mission to free up this land. And he puts his ink on his first big piece of legislation in 1830 called the Indian Removal Act. And it's a squeaker. It passed the House, I believe, by only one vote. And there was a lot of opposition in the North. A lot of missionaries were against this because they saw Native Americans as being acculturized, as becoming civilized, as being brought into the Republic. This was Jefferson's and Washington's idea, and they'll have nothing to do with this forcibly removal idea of Andrew Jackson. There were even some Southerners against it, like Davy Crockett, the congressman from Tennessee, who voted against the Indian Removal Act. Yada, 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 it passed. And now Andrew Jackson has the ability, they say negotiate treaties, but really to force treaties on these Native Americans and to forcibly remove them with state militias from their homes. And that's what begins to occur as soon as this law is passed. All 5 of the civilized tribes, we're talking about the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, we're talking about the Muscogee Creek, the Seminoles, the Cherokees, are going to be rounded up and at gunpoint sent thousands of miles to these new reservations on federal land, not state land, over in Oklahoma. And that land's going to be taken away also. We also have court challenges. A lot of the Cherokees felt that their best avenue wasn't to fight with guns and with bows and with arrows, but rather to go to the Supreme Court. And a really, really big decision comes out in 1832. It's called Worcester versus Georgia, where John Marshall actually sides with the Native Americans and says, you can't forcibly remove these guys. These guys have a right to their land like everybody else. And I think Andrew Jackson's words are something akin to John Marshall made his decision. Now let him go and force it. And he goes on to say that if you let a fire under these guys, eventually it'll get hot enough and they're going to leave. And those treaties begin to get signed right away. We have the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. We have the Treaty of New Ikoto. We have a number of treaties that starts forcing these Native Americans out. The Seminoles, however, would have none of that. They were the only tribe that fought to the end, and thousands of them ended up in the Florida swamps, living out their lives, many of them intermarrying with slaves from that area. But the majority of these Native Americans, the 100,000 plus, are going to be put on the Trail of Tears, thousands of miles to Oklahoma. 1/4 of all Native Americans on the Trail of Tears died on the way from disease, from starvation, from warfare, from being attacked by whites. A really quick story is one of the tribes was crossing the Ohio River in southern Illinois, and the ferry operators were charging these Native Americans $1 a head when they were charging whites 12 cents a head. And there were hundreds of those Native Americans that froze on the side of the river waiting for the ferry because they couldn't afford to cross. But there we go, guys. At this point, by 1838, we have really wiped the Southeast, at least, east of the Mississippi, clean of Native Americans, and that land is gobbled up quicker than you can say gobbled up by whites. They actually had lotteries where they were giving this land away to poor whites who wanted that land. So the Native Americans are now pushed off to these reservations, some of the worst land in the country, in the dry, arid, deserty land of Oklahoma where nothing really grows. And then even there, they're going to be pushed farther into the interior with further discoveries of oil and such like that. So the Indian Removal Act, it's a really ugly episode of American history. Remember the Trail of Tears, and remember Andrew Jackson. He don't care about the Supreme Court, at least not when it came to that. So I hope that you learned a little bit about that.
So a couple of things. I want to highlight how important language is here, friends. The presenter in that video uses the term slaves. And I want to remind us that no one is a slave. People are enslaved. I continue to share this video, though, despite that, because it gives me the opportunity to present that, because so often language is used to desensitize us to the realities of things. I've seen children's books that refer to enslaved people as unpaid workers. So just wanted to point that piece out, that no one is a slave. People are enslaved, and we should use terms that are correct. Also, I continue to share that video because it highlights that even when we are doing our best in this work, we are going to make mistakes. Our language is constantly evolving as we deepen our understanding of language. So this is not to say that when we make a mistake, everything else should be, we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. But just noting that this work it has rocky points, and it's not always linear. And in order to do it, we have to be willing to be wrong. We have to be willing to make mistakes. And so just wanted to point that out, that language is constantly evolving. Okay, so just wanted to share this image as well of land that has been cared for and stewarded by the indigenous inhabitants of Turtle Island, to where they are located today, where they've been relegated to with the impact of colonization. In addition to Native American land being stolen and the violent removal and genocide of indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island, Native Americans also were left to survive the destruction of their very identity. So in the late 1870s, the Carlisle Industrial Training School was one of the most notorious, what was known as Indian residential schools. I would actually refer to them as camps, because they were not exactly schools as we would know them today. The purpose of these Indian residential camps was to kill the Indian, save the child. Children from all over Turtle Island were stolen from their families, often forcibly taken against the will of their parents. And I say this because Indigenous parents who did not willingly hand over their children to white missionaries faced jail time and also violence from the missionaries and the administrators of these schools. And so hundreds of thousands of children, Native American children, between Canada and what we now know today as the US, were taken from their families and sent off to live in these boarding institutions. In these boarding institutions, the children were prohibited from speaking their native language, from dressing in their traditional garb, from practicing their traditional medicines and spirituality. They were also prohibited from using their actual names and were given Anglo-Saxon names. Their hair was cut. And many of the survivors of these Indian residential camps have gone on to write memoirs of surviving significant physical and sexual abuse at the hands of these oftentimes government-funded residential camps. In Canada alone, over 150 First Nations children are documented alone, having been taken from their families and sent off to live in residential schools. In the US, it was roughly 60,000. This number here, 1 in 45, unfortunately is not accurate today, as we continue to find the bodies of these children buried without any grave or documentation, some as young as 3 years old, buried on the property of where these residential schools once stood or still stand. So as of last year alone, I believe over 1,000 children's bodies were found on properties in Canada alone, Kamloops specifically. To my knowledge, we have not been searching the properties or former properties of residential schools here in the US, but I personally think we should. It's also important to note that enrollment for these schools reached their highest point in the 1970s. And the last residential camp was closed in 1996. These shackles that you see on the bottom right-hand corner are an example of the shackles used to take children as young as 4 years old away to these so-called schools. Could I have 2 volunteers read each of these quotes from our former president, Teddy Roosevelt?
Sure, I'll read it.
Thank you.
The one that starts with 19th century or the quote, "I don't go"?
Whichever one you'd like to read.
Okay. 19th century democracy needs no more complete vindication for its existence than the fact that it has kept for the white race the best portion of the New World's surface.
Thank you, Donna. Can I have
You're
one more?
welcome.
Yeah, can I have one more volunteer read the second quote from our former president?
I can read it.
Thanks, Shauna.
I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th.
Thank you. Now, I shared these quotes, friends, not to tarnish anyone's image of our former leaders. My intention is not to tell history better than it was, worse than it was, but simply to share it as it was. And I invite you to consider what impact naming our schools, our organizations, after individuals like President Adams or President Roosevelt, what impact that might have on Indigenous children today, other children of color, children of Mexican descent, et cetera, et cetera. President Roosevelt is presented as the first environmental president of our time. Sorry, someone's, make sure you're muted, friends. Let me do that for us. What's interesting about that, though, is that President Roosevelt and his friends killed more than 11,000 animals in Kenya during their expedition between 1909 and 1910. And the death of those animals included elephants, hippopotamuses, and white rhinos. Roosevelt also helped institute the pay-to-stay trophy hunting policies that still exist today globally and helped to sustain the modern racist myth that wealthy hunters buying government licenses to shoot big game and keep whatever animal parts they choose pays for the wildlife conservation across the globe. What we actually know is that there's no evidence that substantially supports those claims, that trophy hunting actually does offset the cost of conservation work. What we do know, however, is that it reinforces exploitive models of conservation, and it also harms local communities from practicing subsistence farming, hunting, and fishing on their ancestral lands. John Muir is another individual that many of us in our industry have been conditioned to hold in high regard. And while John Muir's contributions to the National Park Service are great, it's important that we tell the full story of these individuals that we are holding in high esteem. John Muir was very integral in establishing the grant for the Yosemite National Park in 1864, and also a good friend of our former president, Teddy Roosevelt. So the language of the grant stated that this land was to be set aside for conservation purposes and to be left unalienable for all time. But the language of that grant completely disregarded the fact that that area had been cared for and inhabited by the Yosemite Band of the Miwok tribe, who'd been thriving in the valley for nearly 4,000 years before John Muir ever stepped foot on that land. It's also important to note that the National Park Service played an integral role in the violent removal of the Miwok tribe during that period of time as well. James John Audubon, known as a naturalist and illustrator, was also a slaveholder who leveraged the knowledge of Indigenous people and enslaved Black men to create his works known as the Birds of America, in which he merely referred to them in his writings as hands traveling alongside white men. As was mentioned in the video, in addition to the Indian Removal Act, as our government found sources of oil and minerals on the reserve land, our government decided that it wanted to acquire that land too, and needed to once again remove the indigenous people who had been relegated to those reservations. And they did this through the Indian Termination Act. This was a piece of legislation that was marketed as granting privileges and rights of citizenship to Native Americans. But what it actually did was end their tribal sovereignty and trusteeship over the reservations that had been designated to them in the treaties. I should note also that there is not a single treaty signed by the US government that has been honored to this date. Between 1953 and 1964, the US government terminated its recognition of over 100 tribes and bands as sovereign independent nations. And these actions affected more than 12,000 Native Americans, including our local Potawatomi tribe here in Wisconsin. Many of these tribes had to endure over 30 years of struggle to get re-recognized by the US government in order to protect their treaties. I now want to share some information about the Chinese Exclusion Act. As you may recall, the Chinese were invited to help support the creation of our railroad system. And once that railroad system was complete, those in power here at the time wanted the individuals who are of Chinese descent to leave.
This is not yet another ethnic oppression story. This is a very American story. The Chinese Exclusion Act forbid Chinese to immigrate to the United States, and those who were here were not allowed to become citizens. Chinese, they are so different. They're taking our jobs. They cannot become Americans.
There was no immigration policy before the Chinese came. So if you ask an American citizen, hey, when was it determined that if you're born here, you're an American? They would have just said, what do you mean? That's the oxygen we breathe. That must have been part of the Constitution. No. In 1898, it was decided that all persons born in the United States are United States citizens, no matter what. The Chinese Exclusion Act was blatantly unconstitutional.
It reflects how America saw itself at one time and how it continues to see itself. Some of it has to do with the fact that we excluded Chinese for 60 years.
This history really is the beginning of where we are today. The issues we're asking, who can come and who cannot come? Who can be American?
So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first time that a nationality was barred from immigration by name. And it was passed by Congress in 1882 and signed by President Chester Arthur. It initially lasted for 10 years and then was extended for another 10 years in 1892 with the Geary Act. The Geary Act also implemented a new requirement that meant that anyone of Chinese origin or descent was required to carry with them an identification card or face deportation, even if they were born here in the US. They could be deported to China. Later measures were placed to restrict the Chinese even further, limiting their access to bail bonds and only allowing entrance to individuals who were teachers, students, wealthy diplomats, and tourists. Congress then closed the gates to Chinese immigration almost entirely and extended the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years in 1902, and then made that extension indefinite in 1904. Now, after significant pushback around the the unconstitutionalness of this act, Congress passed a measure to repeal the discriminatory exclusion law in 1943, but then replaced it with an immigration quota for China, limiting access to only 105 visas per year, essentially making the restrictions of access worse than the Chinese Exclusion Act. Who recalls what the Emancipation Proclamation was about? What is that? What's the Emancipation Proclamation? Okay, so Rosie says it freed enslaved people in states that were in rebellion during the Civil War. Yes, yeah. So it was a process of freeing enslaved people in the Confederate States. So the Emancipation Proclamation occurred in 1863 after the South, the Confederate States, wanted to secede from the nation. They no longer wanted to have to pay taxes on their labor. The South was extremely wealthy. And this was an attempt by President Lincoln to maintain access to those taxes. So why I point this out is that in addition, Abraham Lincoln is often touted as this substantive abolitionist. Historians today are questioning that because 2 years later, Lincoln's administration instituted the 13th Amendment, which means that slavery is legal for anyone convicted of a crime. The 13th Amendment is still in practice today and is still a huge source of prison labor that is utilized by government and private industry alike. Shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation, we also have the introduction of Black codes. Who here is familiar with Black codes? Who knows what Black codes are or ever heard that before? Okay. Black codes are an important piece of history because many of us have the perspective that once the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, individuals of African descent were free. And that, unfortunately, my friends, is not true at all. Black codes were created rather to criminalize what would otherwise be legal activity if one were white, made illegal for those who were Black. And I'll share a quick video outlining more information about Black codes.
In November of 1865, the government that Andrew Johnson had set up in Mississippi passed a set of oppressive laws that applied only to African Americans. Soon, other Southern states followed suit. These laws became known as the Black Codes.
The basic purpose of the Black Codes was to recognize that slavery has been abolished, but to make sure that there is as little change from slavery to freedom as possible.
The key to the Black Codes was what they called vagrancy laws, things like that. Every adult Black person was required to sign a labor contract for the year with a white employer. If they didn't do that, they would be considered a vagrant and they could be fined. And if they couldn't pay the fine, they could be auctioned off to someone who would pay the fine. And then they'd have to work off the fine for that person.
What's even worse than being arrested if you don't have a job is having your children taken away. So your neighbor down the road can go to the courts and say, John Jones, he can't take care of his children. He's indigent, but I'll take them in. And I will train them in farming methods, or I'll train the daughters in housewifery. And I will have their labor, and the parents will get a little bit of money at the end of their period of indenture. But Black parents didn't have a say in this.
a lot of parents are fighting back and saying, no, they don't want their children to be apprenticed. They can take care of them. They also know that in apprenticeship conditions, they can't protect their children from physical and sexual abuse. It becomes a way for the planter class to continue stealing the labor of the children and sometimes stealing the children themselves.
Enforcement of the Black Codes went hand in hand with relentless violence against the freed people.
Outside of cities and towns, the Union Army was shrinking rather than expanding. You're looking at former slaveholders who can't imagine living in a world where slavery doesn't exist if the Union Army is not on the ground and the Freedmen's Bureau is not there to enforce the new rules. Then they were going to do whatever they could to keep the African-American population in a state of subordination.
The Ku Klux Klan is created in Tennessee in 1866. It coincides with the creation of Black Codes. You could argue that on some levels that the Klan is doing the same thing that the slave patrols did. During slavery, the slave patrols would make sure people have passes, making sure that they are not loitering. They're not getting together in bands of people. And the Klan is going to do the same type of thing.
You have people who are targeted because they've managed to acquire a decent amount of land, or their children are in school and a white person in their community is struggling at the same time. What they decide is that the way to deal with this is to attack the person, to take away everything they have, to destroy their property, to run them off their land.
At war's end, Frederick Douglass had wondered what new form slavery might take. After 6 months of Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction, the answer was painfully obvious.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, with the initial creation of the system of whiteness and the classification of what is a white person, a white man, evolved with, with Jim Crow segregation. And so in 1922, as additional European immigrants petitioned the courts to be legally designated as white, the definition of who could get classified as white expanded. And so the Europeans, such as the Polish, the Irish, Italians, Ukrainians, as they were able to gain the classification of whiteness under, during this period of time in 1922, that also meant that they were now able to access naturalization through the 1790 Naturalization Act. With this new expanded definition of whiteness, Virginia, once again, decided that it wanted to pass laws to protect, quote unquote, racial integrity and prohibit race mixing to protect this creation and this concept of whiteness. And so these racial integrity laws were established in 1924 and were not overturned until 1967 with the Loving versus Virginia case. To your left here is a photo of Mr. and Mrs. Loving, who had to petition the courts to be able to have their marriage legally recognized. So I also want to expand your understanding and awareness of additional pieces of legislation that have helped shape our society today and have informed public policy. The first is the Social Security Act. So the Social Security Act created public assistance programs that provided a safety net for millions of white American workers. However, it excluded domestic and wage workers, typically farm workers, maids, who disproportionately 75% of the Black population fell into that category due to restrictions and Black codes of what types of work they could engage in, keeping in mind that Blacks were required to obtain employment through a white employer only after Emancipation Proclamation. And so this meant that if you were a farm worker or a maid, you essentially had no access to Social Security, which again, that impacted 75% of the Black population. The Wagner Act, which made labor union monopolies legal and helped millions of white Americans gain entry into the middle class over the following 30 years, allowed for dominant unions to discriminate on membership based on race and gender. The American Federation of Labor successfully lobbied against the prohibition of racial discrimination in unions. The Fair Housing Act that helped to generate much of the wealth that white families enjoy today, allowing them to leverage the equity in their homes, send their kids to college, pass down wealth, take care of their aging parents. These components were overtly denied in terms of mortgages based on race and ethnicity. The Federal Housing Act also established redlining to justify denying financial services to certain neighborhoods. For those of you who are not familiar with what redlining is, it is the practice of discounting particular areas as high credit risks by lenders due to the racial and ethnic demographics of the inhabitants of that area. You can see here, this is a portion of a map of Milwaukee County. The redlined areas are predominantly in the central city areas, and the blue and green line areas are in the suburbs. 91% of the areas classified as best in class in the 1930s remain middle to upper income today and are still 85% predominantly white. Another important thing to note is that white individuals who were able to access federal home loans in the suburbs that were restricted were able to then purchase property in these redline areas for cash, which also helped build their wealth. So the GI Bill of 1944 meant that white families had access to government guaranteed housing loans, rising property values in the suburbs, and exclusive opportunities to create vast new household wealth. However, for Black families and other non-white families, those home loans were overtly rejected. Black families were excluded from purchasing homes in the suburbs, and they were often restricted to redline neighborhoods. And the segregationist admission policies of most universities of that time, coupled with the lack of space at historically Black colleges and universities, meant that many of the soldiers who had served their country were not able to avail themselves of the promise of the GI Bill. I also want to note that the white families who were able to access those government guaranteed housing loans in the restricted suburbs and then purchase homes in the redline areas to rent out to families of color, oftentimes were able to charge more in those areas for lower quality dilapidated homes because individuals of color were restricted based on racially restrictive covenants based on where they could live. And so it was not at all uncommon for individuals of color to be paying more in rent in a lower lower conditioned housing than white families in higher quality homes in the suburbs. What I find incredible about this history, friends, is that despite all of these intentional tactics used to subdue and control individuals of color, there are still examples of communities of color, Black specifically, amassing some wealth, which is quite frankly a miracle. Unfortunately, however, nearly all of these predominantly wealthy white neighborhoods met a very similar fate. One example of this is Black Wall Street, which was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which I'm going to share a quick video with you today.
We generally call it the catastrophe because we feel like it wasn't a riot. We were not the perpetrators, we were the victims. But it took 80 years to get the state of Oklahoma to acknowledge that.
The Tulsa Race Massacre is believed to be one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history. From May 31st to June 1st in 1921, as many as 300 people were killed, hundreds were injured, and thousands of buildings were destroyed.
On June 1st, they began to systematically destroy neighborhoods, and they had airplanes dropping things down on people's houses, and they had made up their minds to clear the entire area of Black people.
It started after a newspaper reported a Black man tried to sexually assault a white woman. Though it's still uncertain what exactly happened, many did not believe that story. The Oklahoma Historical Society said the most common explanation is Dick Rollins stepped on Sarah Page's foot when he entered the elevator, causing her to scream. A group of armed Black men went to the courthouse to offer help protecting Rowland once they heard talks of lynching. A crowd of white men was also on the scene. A shot was fired and the riots began.
My parents were very distressed because here they are with 5 kids, and the schools had been. I went to Dunbar School, and that was reduced to just rubble. I mean, they blew it up.
Crowds of white rioters went to the Greenwood district, known as Black Wall Street. It was home to an affluent African-American community with banks, hotels, theaters, and new homes.
They took my 8-year-old brother too, where they were holding all the Black men. And we didn't know because we lived on one side of town and they lived on the other. We thought they were locking up the non-Blacks too. But it so happened that it didn't occur that way. What they did was to disarm and lock up all Black men. And then they said to the mob, there's nothing out there now but women and children. So you can do whatever you want to do. And that was when the real terrible things started to happen.
It ended when the city was placed under martial law and National Guard troops were deployed. But Black Wall Street was devastated. Survivors never received compensation for what they lost. Hey!
So between 1934 and 1962, the US federal government backed about $120 billion in home loans. More than 98% of that money went to whites exclusively. In 1954, we saw the Brown versus Board of Education pass, which you may all remember as the ending of school segregation. What you may not be familiar with is the lost year. Are any of you familiar with the lost year? Have heard that story of Governor Faubus? So the lost year was the protest that Governor Faubus led in shutting down the Little Rock, Arkansas public school system for an entire year in protest of having to integrate his school system. This meant that for a whole year, teachers and poor whites who couldn't afford to send their children to private schools were left with no form of education or employment. This also created substantial unrest and violence between Blacks and poor whites in Little Rock, Arkansas. In 1971, President Nixon declares the war on drugs and identifies drug abuse as public enemy #1. Between 1974 and 2014, the federal prison population increased by over 600%. Today, 2/3 of those imprisoned are Black or Latinx. I hope this goes without saying, but I want to also note that $120 billion of tax money was contributed by everyone in the United States, not just whites. In the 80s and 90s, both the Reagan and the Clinton administrations expanded the war on drugs and increased nonviolent drug offenses, increased sentencing, which led to an increase in prison population from 50,000 people to 400,000 by 1997. And then we have the Great Recession. So between 2007 and 2010, due to predatory lending practices, Latinx families, Latine families saw their wealth fall by 44%. Black families saw their wealth fall by 31%, and white families saw their wealth fall by 11%. This is known as the greatest loss of wealth for people of color in modern US history. So while I understand that this information may be jarring to hear because you may not have received this information in your formal education, it is not uncommon for this information to be glossed over. It's important for us to note that America is very young, and we have spent the vast majority of our time practicing slavery, followed by the practice of legalized segregation via Jim Crow and the Black Codes. And we are only 52 years in liberation. I want to remind you that Black women, as an example, didn't get the right to vote until 1965. For reference, my own father was born in 1942. So while oftentimes these components to our society are presented to us as though these are long, long time ago events, they are very recent, very recent. And the impacts of this are still alive today. So I share this pie chart with you to offer ourselves some grace when we find ourselves frustrated with the lack of progress that we are seeing, to have a realistic perspective on just how long people of color have been, quote unquote, liberated. Some may argue that there is yet to be liberation. We're going to take a 5-minute break. When we come back, I'm going to expand on policies and the impacts, rather, of these various policies today. So it is now, if we can return at 10:35, so go ahead and take a breather, move your body if you're able, and we will return for the last portion at 10:35. Thank you. So, how does all of this history impact us today? Well, for starters, the racial wealth gap has nearly tripled since the 1980s. And this is a direct correlation to inequitable access to home loans, restrictions on where individuals can purchase property, and access to just overall capital and education. And even when we measure for education, race is still a stronger indicator of wealth outcomes than educational outcomes. To this day, white high school graduates are still paid more than Black and Latine college graduates on average. When we look at our school systems, race is again a stronger indicator of school discipline than likelihood or rate of engaging in quote unquote bad behavior. What we do know, however, is that the responses from the individuals and administrators of our school systems, their responses towards children tends to be determined based on the race of the child. It's also important to note that the vast majority of our teachers and administrators, especially of public schools, tend to be white and white women. The same demographic is true for our foster care institutions, which are an evolution of the very same administrations that removed the Indigenous children from their homes. Children of color are often referred to Child Protective Services at a higher rate than children from other ethnicities and races. They are also more likely to be reported as victims of child abuse and neglect, and are more likely to be removed from their homes, and are more likely to spend time in foster care and other kinds of substitute care. You'll see here that non-Hispanic Black children are almost twice as likely to be represented in the foster care system than in general population. I want to share a story with you all, two stories that are fairly quick. One is in regards to, I mentioned earlier that just anecdotally, my father was born in 1942 and was one of the individuals who served his country and was not able to avail himself of the promises of the GI Bill until he was able to purchase homes in my white birth mother's name. When my white birth mother passed away, my sister and I were put into foster care as my grandmother on my mother's side wanted custody of us, thinking that she would have control over the little bit of money that my father and my birth mom had put aside for us. Now, what's interesting about this story, friends, is that this is in Racine, Wisconsin in the 1980s. So normally when one spouse or parent passes on, the children go to live with the surviving parent, unless that parent is deemed unfit, which was not the case with my father. But so my sister and I, for almost a year, were sent to live in foster care as my maternal grandmother and my father battled it out in court for control of our guardianship. Once my father was able to put money that they had set aside for us into a trust, my maternal grandmother no longer wanted to pursue guardianship of us, and we were sent home. Imagine the trauma of two young Black girls who had just lost their mother to then be placed with strangers for nearly a year. My story is not unique, and I share this story with you all, friends, to remind you that there are real people behind these numbers. We are not all experiencing the impacts of these practices, these policies, equitably, equally, and that our identities absolutely have meaning. And so while some of you are listening to these stories today and studying them and processing them, for others, we are very much so opening up wounds, and we are leaning on the stories of people who are still living out the impacts of this today. And so I want to remind us that if you find yourself being able to engage in conversations about these injustices and maintain calmness, it's probably most likely because you are not personally impacted by them. So I invite you to consider that your rationality might not actually be so. You may be able to stay rational simply because it is not your home that is quote unquote on fire. When it comes to race and maternal outcomes, again, race more than any other social identity is a key determining factor of infant mortality rates. Even when we measure for the education of the mother, stress and racism are constant factors in the lives of Black women and other women of color, and they are inseparable from their pregnancy experiences. Now, we know that women on average are often, regardless of ethnicity and race, are not believed by our medical institutions and providers. And so we have to spend significant time advocating for ourselves and advocating for the care that we need. But I also want to note that Black women are 60% more likely than white women to deliver their babies early, and Black babies are 230% more likely than white babies to die before their first birthdays. But you know one key factor that changes these demographics, friends? When the physician is Black themselves. When it comes to drugs and incarceration, race, again, is a stronger indicator of likelihood for incarceration than likelihood of usage of illicit drugs. Whites on average use illicit drugs at a higher rate than Blacks. Yet when we look at the population in our prison industry, we see a very different story. We also see the correlation of the spike of Black incarcerated individuals coinciding with the war on drugs. This is also where I remind you that prison labor, due to the 13th Amendment, is a billion-dollar industry. Many corporations, such as Whole Foods, McDonald's, Victoria's Secret, numerous others, as well as government entities and conservation organizations, by the way, utilize the labor of imprisoned people. In our future sessions, I'll go into more details about that. And it's important that we also note that the media also informs the various levels of racism that occur. And while oppression functions intersectionally and across a multitude of identities, you will note that I personally lead this work with race because of these realities. Not to say that other injustices don't occur, but I do believe that a rising tide lifts all ships. When we see the portrayal of Black drug users in comparison to white drug users, there's a very distinct difference in the portrayal and the emotions that our media is attempting to evoke in the reader. But it's not only when it's related to drugs that we see this messaging. We also see this during natural disasters, where, much like John Punch, individuals of color are portrayed differently and sentenced differently in the media for the exact same actions and crimes. And even being a member of the royal family is not enough to absolve someone of the experiences of media racism. When we look at our environmental organizations, the very individuals and components that are tasked with solving our climate crisis, with protecting our public green space, very rarely do we ask ourselves, whose land are we on? How did we acquire it? And we also rarely, I think, ask the question of, do we have a critical mass of individuals who have firsthand experience with the climate crisis and with environmental injustice? Here's what we know about the impacts of environmental hazards and climate change. Individuals such as Aldo Leopold, Prince William, and even my beloved Jane Goodall also have an interesting and layeredness to their contributions to our work. Aldo Leopold has been touted as the father of the land ethic and has received much acclaim for his beautiful writings around land ethic and promoting the notion that we are but citizens of the earth and that it is our civic duty to protect land. I want to point out again our propensity to only acknowledge work when it is named with whiteness and maleness, because Indigenous people have long held the practice, the belief that we are relatives to the earth and that it is our biological duty, our familial duty to care for all living things. And to only take what we need. One of the perspectives that all three of these individuals have at one point or another in their career promoted is the ideology that population control is a key tool to addressing what was once known as global warming, now known as climate change. This unfortunately does not take into account that the richest 10% of our world's population produces almost as much greenhouse gas emissions as the bottom 90% combined. We also actually don't have a population problem. We have a consumption problem. There is enough land and enough resources for all to not only survive, but to thrive on this big blue ball that is floating in space. But when we don't actually follow the money, take a look at the overall consumption that is occurring and the harm that is produced through that, individuals who are already marginalized through the practice of colonization and globalization end up becoming the scapegoats for this, this work. So here are some conservation policies that also impact our community inequitably. The Wilderness Act, that was created in 1964 and marketed as a means of creating recreational space for serenity seekers and naturalists, limited and in some cases prohibited Indigenous tribes and communities of color from practicing sustenance farming, fishing, and hunting. The National Park Service Organic Act, established by the National Park Service in conjunction with John Muir in 1916, led to the violent removal of Indigenous tribes from their homeland. It created policing structures of public natural areas and promoted racial disparity in access to green space due to racial segregation. The intent standard that was established in 1976 by the Supreme Court decision in the Washington versus Davis meant that plaintiffs who are often vulnerable, low income, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities to prove a perpetrator's discriminatory intent in order to win an anti-discrimination claim, rather than being able to simply prove a disproportionate impact, which is the standard that environmental justice advocates are working to get replaced instead. So environmental racism is defined as any government or industry action or failure to act that has a negative environmental impact that disproportionately harms, intentional or not, individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color. What this means for us now, friends, is that 71% of Blacks, 50% of Latine, and 34% of whites are breathing polluted air. And when it comes to overall pollution exposure, Blacks are exposed to 56% more pollution than they cause. Latine communities are exposed to 63% more pollution than they cause. Whites are exposed to 17% less pollution than they cause. So friends, when we take into account slavery, state-sanctioned genocide and violence against people of color, targeted race-neutral policies, exclusionary wealth accumulation policies, unjust naturalization and immigration laws, all of these serve to present us with the racial disparities that we are grappling with today. And while no one is telling individuals who have come to be known as white to feel bad or have guilt for who they are, what I will say though is that if you are a citizen of the United States, part of the legacy that you have inherited is the pervasive systemic way that whiteness and the benefits and privilege and power for those who've come to be known as white have been constructed in this country. We are simply asking that if you are a descendant who has benefited from these historical inequities, that you help us disrupt these inequities and that you help us build better. Because what I see from all of this, friends, is that this all happened strategically. All of the disparities that we see today are a direct result of design, which means we can design better. So I have a question for you again. How do you get ahead in America? What we see today, friends, is that we have very well-meaning programs We have after-school programs that teach children how to read because our school system is failing to teach children how to read. We have pop-up clinics because our healthcare system is failing to cure and heal and help people. We have community gardens and food banks to address hunger. And all of these are well and good. And it makes us feel in the interim that we're doing something. I want to offer for your consideration, though, that unless we are actively dismantling systemic racism, we are only putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds. We have to begin addressing the root cause of these inequities. And in order to change the racially inequitable outcomes that we see, we have to change the systems that produce them and the individuals that participate, consciously or unconsciously, in maintaining them. James Baldwin said that the past is all that makes the present coherent. And further, the past will remain horrible for exactly as long as we refuse to assess it honestly. So how then is this system of racism maintained? Well, it's maintained through colorblindness, revisionist history, internalized racism, victim blaming and shaming, solely focusing on individual versus institutional outcomes, and white fragility, which serves to immediately derail any conversation of racial inequity. If you're not familiar with white fragility, it is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial-based stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. And this is a term coined by sociologist Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And this phenomenon, as I mentioned, ensures that conversations about race are derailed and the status of white supremacy and white comfort are upheld. I'm going to let Dr. Robin DiAngelo expand on some of the common myths that are told about race.
To be white in so many ways is to be raised to be functionally illiterate on the topic of race. I am white, and part of being white is that I was not raised to see myself in racial terms. I mean, I understood that somebody had race, but not really me. To be white is to see oneself outside of race, to see oneself as a unique, special individual, exempt from the forces of socialization. I'll never forget a moment of standing beside a Black man leading a workshop on race, and a white woman said to him, "I don't see color." He said, "Well, then how are you going to see racism?" "Because I am Black. I do think you know that, and I have a different experience than you do. And you're not going to be able to understand that, and you're not going to be able to support the parts of that experience that are really painful and problematic if you refuse to acknowledge my reality." I don't see color is really a way of saying I refuse to acknowledge your reality. What's important about that narrative is it reveals what the person thinks racism is. So if the person is using proximity, fondness across race as evidence of a lack of racism, in order for that to be good evidence, a racist must not be able to do that. So that rests on an understanding that a racist cannot tolerate proximity to people of color. And I'm hoping that we can see that's pretty absurd, because trust me, even avowed racists can tolerate being around people of color, and often are. You cannot talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue. And when someone says it's about class, that tends to function as a way to get race off the table. First of all, we're already divided by race. And focusing on race is not what did it. I would say not focusing on race, refusing to grapple with how race shapes virtually everything is what keeps us divided. And that is a very white narrative. All of those narratives function to get race off the table, close the exploration, exempt the person from any further engagement, and protect the racial hierarchy and the white position with it, which is an unequal hierarchy. The challenge I want to offer my fellow white people is changing the question from if to how. So dominant culture asks, if I'm racist. And I want to change that question to how have I been shaped by the forces of racism? How is racism manifesting in my life? Because it circulates 24/7, 365. None of us can be and none of us were exempt from its forces. And this is where individualism can come in. I have a particular story, but that story didn't exempt me. And so I can ask myself, how did all the things I see as unique about me set me up into the overall racist structure? Because it did.
So Dr. Beverly Tatum, who is the author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, uses the analogy of an airport walkway to describe racism. And I would appreciate a few volunteers reading some of these analogies for us today. Could I have one volunteer read this first slide on active racism?
I can do that.
Thanks, Claire.
I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it.
Thank you. What about passive racism? Could I have one more volunteer, please?
Active racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking.
Thanks, Rachel. And lastly, could I have a volunteer read active anti-racism?
I can do it. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racist ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go to the same destination as the white supremacist. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others.
Thank you, Andrea. One of my favorite poets, Arundhati Roy, says that a new day is not only possible, she is on her way. And in order for us to understand this new way, our work has to begin internally. We have to bear in mind that while this work is pervasive and systemic, we as individuals prop it up. And so we have the most control over ourselves. So I want to expand a bit here on the manifestations of unconscious bias to help illustrate where we are most likely to get tripped up in this work. You may have seen this image before of the artist who is intending to explain to the viewer of this piece the difference between equality and equity. And much like the first video that I showed, where the author uses a term I recommend we avoid using because it is incorrect, this image too highlights that even when we are doing our best work, we are still leaving ourselves open to critique. We are still, we're going to make mistakes, but that cannot be the reason that we don't do the work. We have to go into it knowing that we will trip up, that the structures that have been instilled in our society are designed to make this work difficult. It is designed to trip us up, but yet we must persist forward. Now, some of you may think that my issue with this image is that all of the characters appear to be able-bodied white boys, and that there's a fence in the way, and all of those things absolutely merit their own conversation. But here is an example of someone who also tried to fix it, and to which I say, nice try, not quite. And the reason, friends, is because the key component that is still being portrayed here that is false is that the reason we need equity is because some of us are just not as capable as others. You see, both in this picture and in this picture, the child with the smallest body is perceived to be the most in need. We are presenting ourselves with an image that states that if one is not successful, it is by their own doing, and therefore we need to prop them up and help them because they're just not as capable as the rest of us. That is completely false. I like this image better because it showcases the actual truth, that the problem is not with the individual, the problem is with the foundation, with the landscape, the environment. You see here, each of these children are equally capable because genius is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And so this image highlights that the injustice is in the landscape, and that is what we need to fix. So when we talk about racial equity and how we're going to achieve it, we have to look at it in two parts, as an outcome and as a process. As an outcome, racial equity is achieved when race no longer determines one's socioeconomic, health, housing, education, or criminal justice outcomes. Essentially, when everyone has what they need to thrive. As a process, racial equity is applied when we acknowledge and account for the past and current inequities, when we tell the truth, and those who are most impacted by structural racial inequity are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of institutional policies and practices that are going to impact their lives. I'm going to leave you all with the words from another favorite author of mine, Bettina Love, who has written many books, but one in particular that I recommend you read is We Want to Do More Than Survive. To bring us back around to our founding history that is actually an abolition. Oftentimes our history is touted as one of trauma and enslavement and injustice. But we are all here today because of abolition and abolitionists. And we need more abolitionists. That work is not done yet. But to be an abolitionist, we must be a co-conspirator in disrupting the existing systems of inequity and oppression.
And can you break down for us this difference between an ally and a co-conspirator?
Yeah, so
I bet you can.
So, the book is about like this idea of abolitionist teaching, right? And so, shout out to upstate New York. I'm from upstate New York. We don't like New Yorkers, but that's okay. When you from upstate New York, like, where you from? I'm from upstate. Queens? No. Brooklyn? No. Albany? No. I'm from upstate New York. Rochester, New York. 90 miles from Canada, right? And so, so we had abolitionists in upstate New York. That's where I grew up. And the one thing about an abolitionist had to be a co-conspirator. I mean, I want y'all for a second to just think about the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad freed over 100,000 enslaved Africans and Black folks, right? Think about this. There was no Twitter. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram. This was all off trust.
and love of each other. And to say that this system of racism and bondage, no more.
Yeah.
We did that. It was everyday people. Farmers, bankers, doctors, teachers, nurses, all ethnicities. We did that as a country. Someone came to your door, gave you a code, you just had to trust them. And so I wanted to bring that back. What would it mean for us in 2019 to think about what it would mean to be an abolitionist and to be a co-conspirator? And in the book, I use James Tyson. Now, many people are not familiar with who James Tyson is. You know Bree Newsom. Bree Newsom was the young Black woman who took that Confederate flag down in South Carolina 8 days after Dylann Roof went into the AME church. And I tell the story in the book because I think it's an important story because Bree Newsom and James Tyson did not know each other. There were some folks who got together and said, that flag is coming down. They said, and a Black woman's gonna take it down. They taught Bree how to climb. They had Bree's bail money ready. And that morning, Bree Newsom and James Tyson were at an IHOP. They got the word, come take the flag down. Bree Newsom climbs up on the pole to take the flag down. Now, this is where the difference between an ally and a co-conspirator is. James Tyson, now there's a gate for the flagpole. James Tyson isn't standing like outside the gate. Okay, like Bree, they coming, Bree. Like Bree. No, James Tyson, he is inside. And then the police say, you know what? We can get her down. Tase the pole. James Tyson, because he wasn't here, he was here, said, okay. He put his hand on the pole. That white man at that moment understood why he was there. He put his hand on the pole and he knew that the police would not tase that pole with a white man, healthy white man, right there. He saved her life. That's what it means to be an ally. You can stand out there, and allies know all the language. They read all the books. They come to the meeting with all the terms. Right? They read the report before you read the report. I always say allies make Black folks feel bad. Like, did you read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book? Like, you know, I've been busy being Black. Right? I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book, but I know it's fire. So they come and they know everything and they good. And then after the meeting, you're like, well, what we gonna do? They go, you're like, hey, they left already? Where'd they go? I'm gonna call an Uber, right? So that's the difference between being an ally and a co-conspirator. You know, and this is that back to that abolitionist, is to put something on the line for somebody.
Yeah.
Take a risk to see how to use your whiteness. And I tell folks all the time, whiteness is like a bank. And it just, your ATM card just replenishes itself. So spend it. As the kids say, cash out. Right, cash out. It's gonna come right back. And so to be a co-conspirator, I try to write in the book is to take risks for somebody. To put something on the line, but to use it in a way in which when you're using your privilege.
Yes.
Use it. And I'm not just talking about white folks, I'm talking about cisgender folks. Use it for trans folks, like use it for queer folks. Like put something on the line, take a risk. It doesn't have to be small risk, big risk. James Tyson simply said here, put his hand on the pole. That's it. And that's what we are talking about with code.
So friends, I have some homework for you as we come to a close. I would love for you each to consider your identities, behaviors, the spaces and positions of power that you occupy, and to reflect on how you can work towards racial equity in your personal and professional life. And to also spend some time reflecting on what existing behaviors or mindsets might merit a bit more exploration. Now, a word of caution, especially for our white colleagues. Please, in the name of all that is good, resist your potential desire to want to dialogue immediately after this with your colleagues of color. Because what you may inadvertently end up doing is placing your colleagues of color in a space where they are required to comfort you. Please do not do that. I do, however, encourage you to dialogue with people of a shared identity as you. If your colleagues of color want to dialogue about this with you, they will seek you out. And forgive me, colleagues of color, if I'm speaking for you, but there is so much potential harm that happens when these workshops are conducted intersectionally, because we don't all experience the realities that I've enumerated today the same, and our work is different. And so to prepare us for this different work, I want to forewarn everyone that in our next session, we will be practicing caucus groups. This is also strategically why I do not have a breakout session for this piece, even though I'm sure many of you would love to dialogue further about it. And I encourage you to do so, but do so mindfully with your identities in mind. There will be pre-readings for our next session, so please do make sure that you review those prior to our next session. I'm sorry, not their next session is reflective leadership. So the one after that, which will be foundations of internalized racism. In addition, I encourage you, those of you who are joining with your colleagues from your organization, if you are interested in hosting reflection sessions, which I encourage you to do, some potential prompts for you would be, what were you thinking and feeling and considering throughout this presentation? How does this history align or differ from what you've learned in your formal education? And how does it impact the way that you think about race, both in a broad context and in the context of your own racial identity? And, oops, sorry. And with that, friends, I will leave you all to it. And I'm happy to take any questions with the remaining few minutes that we have. But otherwise, I will turn it back over to Laura, and I look forward to seeing you all again in our next session together.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I've gone ahead and I put the workshop schedule for the remaining workshops in the chat, as well as the landing page for the work that we're doing here today and in the future. The recording from today's session will be posted here, and I will follow up with you all who've registered with a specific email as soon as we have the recording from today completed. Go ahead and please complete the quick evaluation survey that I dropped into the chat. We welcome your feedback. We want to continue to do this work to the best of our ability. And also, people can still register and they can watch this. This will be posted for 1 month before we start the next series. But for all those who complete the series, we will be offering a certificate, a Chicago Wilderness Certificate of Completion for this racial equity work that we've embarked upon. And once again, I want to thank the Illinois Department of Natural Resources for supporting this work. And I will put that information about the Tree City USA program in the chat and hope that you can help us with future workshops that we have on that issue. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.